Hello everyone. So we finished chapter 7, and now we're in with chapter 8, which is all about motivation. And so, let's get right into it. And as you can see, as always, what I've started doing now is I'm showing your review guide. And so, for what we're going to be covering today for chapter 8, there's going to be 8 things. So, easy to remember. And the way that this is going to be set up, so I'm going to go ahead and make myself disappear. The way it's set up is there's going to be 3 different sections, even though there are 4 different modules. So if I go in, there we go, you'll see that there's 4 different modules. So talking about motivation, hunger and eating, sexual motivation, and emotions. The way that we're going to be covering it is we're going to talk about the motivation today. We're going to talk about hunger and eating and the sexual motivation together in one video. And then we're going to finish with emotions. And so, as always, the first thing you're going to need to know is what motivation is. And this is that first thing that you're going to need to know on the exam. And when we talk about motivation, what we mean is it's all the processes that activate, direct, and sustain goal-directed behavior. So essentially, you want to do something. Being able to start doing it, so being able to activate, being able to kind of go in the direction that you want to go for that behavior, so directing it, and then being able to continue doing it. So every single day, chasing after that goal, so sustaining it, is what makes up motivation. And there's all sorts of different ways that we can explain motivation. And it's going to be kind of broken down into 3 parts, but those 3 parts can be broken down even further. And you'll see what I mean. But the first one is looking at kind of these early theories of motivation, and it's more the biological theories of motivation. So, for example, there's the instinct theory. And essentially what this says is that we're motivated out of instinct. We don't really think about it, it just happens. And so, for example, when we look at Freud, James, McDougall, the whole idea is that, similar to animals, we're just acting out of instinct. And so the reason why we do something is, to survive. The reason why we do a behavior, why we're motivated to do something, is just to survive. It's in our basic DNA. However, and you'll see it's kind of criticized towards the bottom, human behavior is too complex to really be whittled down into just being instinct. But it's one of the theories out there, and it goes into a little bit more detail. And so one of the kind of biological sources for motivation is the drive theory. And the drive theory suggests that we have these biological needs. So again, it goes into instinct, but we have these biological needs. And so in order to meet those needs, we're motivated. So it pushes us towards us. It drives us towards it. And so this is the next thing that you're going to need to know for the exam, and you're going to need to know the name. And the name is not on here, so that's why it's important to be watching these videos. And the name that you need to know is Clark Hull. So Hull. Clark Hull is the person who came up with this drive theory. And the way that I remember this is I think that you need, let's say that you're moving somewhere, you're going to use U-Haul to drive your stuff somewhere. So you're motivated to, start your new life, you're moving somewhere, you get a U-Haul. So Clark Hull is in charge of the drive theory. And again, it's just that there's these certain drives that we have. It's this internal state. And very similar to reinforcers, if you recall that from a previous chapter, you have both primary and secondary. And so primary drives are, again, those biological drives, those basic needs. You're hungry, you're thirsty. And that's another thing that you will need to know for the exam, that these biological drives are what we call your primary drives. Whereas everything else that just leads you to those primary drives, so, you're being driven by money in order to afford food, would then be those secondary drives. Similar as well in drive theory, there's also the stimulus motive. So this isn't really looking at being driven by those biological needs in the sense of like food, but it's this innate need to explore. So it's innate. So it means that like we seem to be stimulation seekers. We don't like to not feel stimulated in some way. When we feel bored, we don't learn much, which is why I'm trying my best to go through this quicker rather than slowly. So a stimulus motive, you need some sort of stimulation. And the phrasing that I would remember for this, because again, you also need to know what stimulus motive is for the exam. It is being driven through curiosity. So curiosity. When you see curiosity on the exam, think stimulus motive. And looking at these sources of motivation, again, there's the arousal theory, which is very similar. So it's looking at your levels of arousal, and if it dips too low below that kind of optimum level, then you seek ways, or you're motivated to find ways to increase it. And now it should be said that there are instances where our level of arousal is reduced, and it needs to be reduced, so when we're relaxing, when we're sleeping. But then there's also instances where we have levels where our arousal is increased. And so let's say that you're learning something in class, and if that arousal level gets too low, I've lost you. You're going to find different ways to entertain yourself. You're going to get on your phone. You're going to talk to your friends. You're going to doodle in your notebook. You find ways of increasing that arousal. And then there's this idea of a sensation seeker. And this is another thing, again, that you are going to need to know on the exam. And a sensation seeker essentially is someone that has a higher need for arousal. And so it's someone, as it says here, that needs kind of a steady diet of highly stimulating activities. So these are also known as like adrenaline junkies. People that just always are going out there, they're thrill seekers. They're just trying to do everything they can to get stimulated. It feels good. So those are sensation seekers. And in the book in this class, on page 283, you can look and see if you are a sensation seeker. And so again, that would mean that you just kind of need a higher need for arousal than most individuals. So now we get into the psychological sources of motivation, because all the other ones that we just talked about are kind of more biological, whether it's your instincts or, just naturally needing, that some sort of level of stimulus or arousal. Psychological sources of motivation, on the other hand, look at us being motivated, psychologically. So there's the incentive theory, and this is the whole idea that we are motivated towards some sort of a reward. So it's not this innate or natural thing, it's like we want something, and so that motivates us, or is the source of our motivation. And similar to this, we have the psychosocial needs. So these are more interpersonal needs. So it's still that need for something, some sort of a reward, but you get that through some sort of an interaction with other people. So you have the need for affiliation, which is when you're motivated to essentially feel like you belong. So you're motivated to behave a certain way or do certain things, so you fit in with a group, so you feel like you belong. There's also, and this is the next thing that's going to be on the exam, the need for achievement. So this is the need to excel. This is that feeling that, you want to feel like you're doing good compared to others. Like you wouldn't feel a sense of achievement if you didn't have other individuals to compare yourself to. And so that's why it's seen as a psychosocial need. And if we look at this further, this need for achievement, it can be broken down into two different things, extrinsic or intrinsic motivation. And so let's first talk about intrinsic motivation. And both intrinsic and extrinsic you will need to know on the exam. Intrinsic motivation is when you're motivated on internal gratification or feeling good on the inside. So this is when you feel like you've done good and you're proud of yourself. You don't need the approval of others, you just feel good. it's internal, it's intrinsic. So I would focus especially, again, for the sake of the exam, on this whole idea of self-gratification. You are proud of yourself. So self-gratification for intrinsic. Extrinsic, on the other hand, is this external or outside desire. So this is the whole thing of wanting rewards, wanting a sticker, wanting a lollipop, wanting a trophy, wanting money. So again, for the sake of the exam, I would focus on this thing like such as wealth. So you are motivated because you want something out of it. So money is a good example for extrinsic. So intrinsic, inside, extrinsic, outside. And then when we look at achievement, there's also avoidance motivation. So when we're in an achievement situation, you can be pulled in two different directions. Either you're motivated to achieve in a successful way, so you want to do well, or you're actually motivated to avoid failure. And this is very important because a lot of times what happens is there's individuals that are really, really good at one thing. And so they stop there and they say, okay, I'm really good at this sport. I'm just going to do this sport for the rest of my life. I'm not going to try anything else because then people will think I'm not good at something. And so there's this need to feel like you have to be the best, and therefore you can't try anything that you won't be good at. And so it's motivation through avoidance. So it's good to know those two differences. And there's some things that are discussed in this. So disadvantages of being high in avoidance. It means you don't try anything new. And when you don't try anything new, it's very hard to grow as an individual. And it's wonderful to try new things. And so it's, as always with so many things, it's finding a balance. But that's kind of the difference between achievement versus avoidance motivation. And then the very last thing, which you will also need to know, is something that's known as the hierarchy of needs. And again, it's a little difficult on here, just like with the drive theory, which is Clark Hull. You need to know the name for the hierarchy of needs. And this was talked about before, way back in chapter 1, but it is Maslow. So Maslow is the one who came up with a hierarchy of needs. And this is the whole idea that what motivates you changes depending on the situation that you're in. And it starts at the bottom and it works its way up. So the very first thing is physiological motivation. So are you hungry? Are you thirsty? This goes way back to those basic biological needs. If you're hungry, you're not going to focus or be motivated by anything else until you've eaten. So let's say that your physiological needs are set, then it moves up to safety. So do you feel safe? This is something that's very important in education. We need to make sure as teachers that our classrooms make you feel safe. If you don't feel safe in a classroom, you are not going to learn. Just like similarly, if you're hungry, during a class, you're also not going to be focusing on learning. After that, we then get to this idea of love and belongingness. So that emotional intimacy. So after your physiological needs are met, after your safety needs are met, now you're more focused on emotional intimacy, on friendships, social connections. So feeling like, again, going back to education, that your teacher is there for you and cares about you and wants to help you. Then after that, we get to esteem, so the whole idea of achievement, respect, prestige, status, approval. This is when, more educational things are starting to play a role. So again, as teachers, what this means is we have to make sure that all of these things are met for you before you are motivated to learn. And then finally, after esteem is met, there's this whole idea of self-actualization. So fulfillment of your individual potential, being your best possible self. That's the hierarchy of needs, which was created by Maslow. And so what we talked about is, again, we broke down motivation. There was kind of the biological source, and then there was the psychological source. And the biological source had stuff like, you're motivated through instinct, you're motivated through certain needs or drives, or you're motivated by just a need for stimulus or arousal. These are all biological things. Then we learned about psychological sources. So again, being motivated through incentives, if you're being given something or getting something out of it, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic. And then psychosocial needs. So this went back to achievement through avoidance, and then the hierarchy of needs. And so that is actually it for Module 8.1. And then when we come back, we will start talking about, there we go, hunger and eating, where we're going to be talking about obesity, and then we're also going to be talking about various health issues, both not only for obesity, but also for various eating disorders.